like to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over very briefly to Constance Backhouse, the chair of the Heritage Committee. My name is Allison Kirk Montgomery, for the record, and I'm the project manager of the Diversifying the Bar Lawyers Make History project. Constance?
Well, it's a great honor to be here with Allison Kirk Montgomery and Sophia Sperdakis, part of an incredible team that has been working on this really innovative and exciting project. I am representing the Heritage Committee of the Benchers of Convocation of the Law Society of Upper Canada. I know many of our lawyers aren't all that familiar with everything that's done at the Law Society, except for when they pay their dues. And they notice the cost of the enterprise. But one of the parts of our work that I'm most proud of is the attention to history, the history of the profession, and our efforts to document it and to preserve it and to discover it, because so much of it is untold and unknown. And I think lawyers as a profession have a very strong interest in history, more than many others. But what we have not done is actually put it into motion. And so this project is a wonderful example of the interest of our profession in branching out so that our lawyers look like the population that we represent. And this is a project that is designed to reach out to lawyers of diverse heritage to find out about their origins and histories and challenges and successes. And as we began that research, we discovered that the Hellenic Canadian Lawyers Association was ahead of all the rest in its chronicling of the history of the community. And so we've started here. You are the first group to come in and have a taping and have us really try to put together some more of this material. So I'm going to turn it right back over to Allison and Sophia to speak about the goals of tonight.
Thank you, Constance. As Constance said, this is the inaugural roundtable. The Greeks are first, I think, in many things, but certainly in this project. And again, thanks to...
First at the Olympics, anyway.
That's what Sophia told me. So, other parts of the project that you may have seen, and some of you have participated, are the online biographies, short biographies of pioneers and of exceptional lawyers from your community. And now this is the beginning of the second phase, which is individual and group interviews of people, of lawyers of diverse communities. So what we want to talk about, what I would like you to talk about, is you are Greek, at least you have Greek background and ancestry, you are lawyers. What is that intersection of those two things in your identity? So we're interested in your recollections and your reflections on what it means not to just to be a lawyer, but to be a lawyer of Greek heritage in Ontario, and whether or not your profession has shaped your Greek identity, Greek Canadian identity, or whether your Greek Canadian identity has shaped your professional career and choice of career. So that sounds like a lot. Let's just start with something really easy, which is, would you please introduce yourselves, and just in a quick snapshot about your career, and then we'll talk about your background from your career, from your community, and then who knows where it will go. Sophia, would you like to begin?
Hi, hello. I'm Sophia Sperdakis, a policy counsel here at the Law Society, originally from Montreal. My people came from Sparta in the early turn of the 20th century. So that's my origins.
Thank you.
Ernie Lucadellis. I was born and raised in North Bay. My parents came from Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. And I was born in North Bay, raised in North Bay, educated in North Bay and Toronto, and practiced in North Bay for 21 years and on the bench for 28 and a half.
One of the first judges from this community. Probably the first.
Right. I guess the first one was Charlie Ferezis in Sudbury. He was on the provincial bench, then my brother, and then myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you much.
Andromachy Kirkatsanis, and I was born and raised in Toronto. My parents came from the north of Greece in the early 50s after the war, and I practiced as a lawyer for a few years, 5-6 years. Then went to government, and I'm now a judge of the Court of Appeal.
Thank you.
I'm Ria Zimus. Ria is short for Eleftheria, and I'd probably use that name if people could pronounce it. I was born in Montreal, and I still very much feel like a Montrealer living in Toronto. My father came to Canada to study in the early 50s. Our roots are from northern Greece, from Kastoria. And I took the, we're from
My
the same.
mother's from Kastoria too.
It doesn't get much closer than that. And I took the trip on the 401, as did many allophones from Quebec in 1988, and have stayed here.
Thank you. Paul?
Oh, good afternoon. My name is Paul Leatherdale, and I'm from the Archives Department here at the Law Society. And unfortunately, I don't have any Greek blood in me, so I will be an honorary Greek this afternoon if you'll have me.
And have added a lot to the project.
I thought
through
you
the
changed your
work.
name too.
Jim?
My name is Jim Karras. I'm a latter-day immigrant like Rian Mahi. I practiced, I was in private practice for about 14 years, and then I went to in-house counsel with big quotation marks because I do anything but practice, it seems. I am heavily involved in Greek community affairs from law school, and I'm very interested in the history of the Greek community, of course, lawyers as well, especially lawyers, I should say, but very much set involved in the community.
Thank you.
Jim Vavitsas. I'm also, past president of the Hellenic Canadian Lawyers Association up to this past May. I'm also born and raised here in Toronto, although I do live in Markham presently with my wife and 3 children. So I'm quite busy at home as well. Jim and I started this project in late '02, and we had both a keen interest in history, and specifically Greek history and the Greek immigrant experience. And we wanted to connect that experience with professions, and not so much doctors, but lawyers, just because both of us are lawyers. And I've turned everything over to you, Allison. So it's great to be here. I'm very, very pleased and I guess honored to be a part of this group amongst so many distinguished people. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for handing over all the fonts, yes. Gina?
Yes.
Good. What about you?
My turn.
Yes.
I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. It would be lovely to see everybody again in person. My name again is Gina Alexandrus. I am born and raised in Toronto. My parents came from Sparta as well, back in the 50s, and have been here for many, many years since. In terms of practice, I was in practice originally for a few years, and have been in higher education, legal education, in administrative capacities for the past, about 14, 15 years now. And as Jim says, I feel to use the title pioneer still seems a little awesome to me, and I'm honored to be a part of this group as well, so thank you for inviting me.
That's great. Thank you. Constance, did you wish to add anything at this point if we've come around?
I share everyone's love of history. My roots are Scottish, English, and Polish, not Greece.
Oh.
But I have written a lot. I've written a number of books on the history of women in law, and the history of racism in law, and so I have just a deep well of fascination with pulling together records from our past.
It's wonderful. Well, it seems like we have a good range of careers and dates that families first came over from about 1900 on. Certainly some of the pioneers on the website. I think the earliest is Charles Furiezo's family, who came in 1897. and up into the 50s, as we talked about. So is it correct to speak of the Greek community, or should we talk about a number of Greek communities? That's one question I would like you to think about for a moment. But what about the fact that it seems to me that the Greeks are a very small proportion of the Canadian population, but I think they're overrepresented in people who have higher education and certainly in lawyers. So I would like to know why you think that is, and particularly why you became a lawyer. Did it have anything to do with your background? Who would like to start that?
I'll start out with a mild disagreement about being overrepresented, because all my life I've been saying we're underrepresented. And
Is that Jim? Can I ask him to speak?
yes, it is. It's Jim. Yes,
Thanks,
Gina.
Jim.
Until very recently, the complaint of the Greek community of Toronto, that's a capital C, the organized Greek community, the view was that we are underrepresented in, shall we say, the ruling class, except for the Lukidelis brothers, who are a bit of an exception up north. There were no judges in Toronto. There were no MPs at the time, except for John Midges. And we seem to be on the sidelines of Canadian society. And our complaint and our mission was that that should be put to an end. I'm glad to say that within very few years, we saw significant changes in electing a couple of MPs, electing a couple of MPPs, having a minister, having Bill Basil on the provincial bench and Andramahi on the Superior Court. And as far as we have a reasonable representation in the profession, but that's within recent times. And if you want to divide sort of the Greek community of how many there are, there's the pre-war community from Asia Minor, like Ernest, and some from Sparta who came at the end of the 19th, really early 20th century. But they were a handful. By 1940, there were only 10,000 Greeks in all of Canada. So most of us are post-war immigrants, the 50s, like Mahi, like me. And the ones that came from Asia Minor tended to be the best educated, and that's why Nick Paul and there's several others that came from there. They're really the cream of Greek society that were eventually turfed out. The post-war ones were the peasants, basically. Ria's father was an exception, but he came to study, but most of them were farmers or factory workers where there were no factories. So the idea of becoming a lawyer, in my case, it just sort of dawned as a good profession. And for the rest, I'm not sure. But that's my squib.
So may I just ask you, your interest in the Greek community and the status of the community came after you became a lawyer?
No, I was before. I was invited to join an association, then I was invited to join the Greek community. So I was doing legal aid work even when I was a student. So I've been involved in Greek community affairs for 35 years and change.
Thank you.
Just to answer one of your questions that you posed at the beginning, Allison, it's there's several Greek communities. I think each city has their own, and there's no contact or very little contact between them or among them.
Well, you're from North Bay.
That's right.
And North Bay seems to be a special Greek community, I must say, with the Lukidelis brothers. I believe Stella Panarites.
Stella Panarites. She was born and raised in Cobalt, and came to North Bay to practice
Yes.
later. Yeah, she was a special.
Can you tell us a bit about why you became a lawyer, Ernie?
Well, I went in for my MBA, and I took my first year, and I decided I didn't want to work for anybody else. So
By default?
I thought the law was the easiest way to work on my own. Basically, that's it. Plus, my brother was already in it.
Yes, and you have some ancestors who were lawyers, or at least relatives, were you?
Relative. I had an uncle who was a lawyer in Egypt,
Mhm.
Greek. Yeah, he was married to my mother's sister, and so that,
Okay, so we
some
have the
background
north.
there.
Allison,
have
if
the
I can interject,
1950s.
just
Yes.
by way of clarification, Toronto, I think, and Jim, maybe you can jump in here, is a little unique in the sense that the Greek community and the church are separate and apart, if you will. Whereas I think if you get outside of Toronto, for example, in Windsor and London, out east, the Greek community and the church are working hand in hand. And I know in London specifically, the church is the Greek community. And I think that's the way it is up north as well.
Yeah,
Ernie?
it is,
Yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah.
I just want to point that out, that
Thank you.
Toronto is its own,
Is that to do with the age of the community?
I think there's, probably Jim, you can speak on
No,
that. There's
he
there's some
speaks
history there.
about what we want and not what we have. There is a Greek community of Toronto, a separate corporation, which wants to be the representative, the spokes corporation for all the Greeks. It isn't, but it's not strictly a civic organization. It runs 4 churches. There is no such thing as a community without a church except for the Hellenic community of York. There they have one community that has some schools and strictly runs cultural things, and there's a church. In the rest of Toronto, there are what they call themselves communities, but they are around a church. A single church calls itself the Greek community of St. Nicholas, the Greek community of the Annunciation. But the Greek community of Toronto is the largest one, and the representative of the Greeks, in quotation marks, has in fact 4 churches, so we're very much a church organization as well, because most of our functions and most of the money comes from the collection plate.
I must say, Jim is talking about the Greek organizations or the Greek community organizations, and I'm someone who considers myself Greek Canadian, and I don't think of it in terms of Greek communities or Greek organizations. I, unlike Jim, have not been involved really in those organizations, just in the Hellenic Lawyers, Lawyers Association, I guess it was called, back in the early 80s. I was one of the founding members. But for me, my Greek heritage was really more a question of who I was. And I felt that I was fortunate to be able to pick and choose the best from Greek culture and the best from my Canadian, in quotes, culture. And so to me, that just provided an extra richness. The Greek culture is very much one that is strong on family values, on community participation, on relationships with people, a love of good, I was going to say joie de vivre, but I better say kefi. And so to me, my Greek heritage really is just a part of who I am, and I haven't participated in those associations. Rather, I've brought it into who I am as a person, and more directly been involved with other lawyers of Greek descent or Greek Canadian lawyers. You asked earlier why we went to law school.
Yes.
And I have to say that in my household, it was a given that all the children would go to university and pick a profession, not just get a degree. It would have to be a profession. And that was an expectation from very early on. I'm not sure I ever made an independent decision to do so. I just did what was expected, and it seemed to me that if you were interested in the arts, which I was, then law was the profession. And I'm not one of those who always knew I was going to be a lawyer or was passionate about the law before I went to law school. It's come with the study of law, and with being a lawyer, that passion has developed, but it's not one that was there before I went. So I think I answered a couple of your questions.
I'd like to build on that, if I may, because one of the values, and I come across a number of different cultural groups. I practice in Aboriginal law and meet very many First Nations and different perspectives, so I don't think it's fair to say it's unique to the Greek community, but certainly education and a good education that's going to put you in a better position from where our parents started or our grandparents, wherever that starting point is, was a cornerstone. And I smile when I hear Andromache because my father is a graduate of McGill University, and on Saturday afternoons, as far as my memory can reach, my mom would have 2 hours off to herself shopping downtown, and my dad would take us to the lower campus at McGill, and we'd feed the squirrels, and there were no cars permitted, so we learned how to ride our bikes there, and it was on the grounds of McGill. Now, it's a very beautiful part of the city, but I sometimes wonder if implicitly, we knew where McGill was before I knew where my address was.
Subliminal.
As a child.
I have to interject here because my story is identical. I'm also from Montreal. We used to drive by McGill, my sister and I. My father would look out the window and point, and he would say, "That's McGill University. That's where you're going." And we would both say, "Yes, Daddy," and we both went to McGill. So,
Allison, can I
Yes,
step in? Or-
please.
Sorry, I've got to draw on what Andromache mentioned because I think my experience is very much more so with the small C Greek community, more
Yes.
a feeling of Greek ethnicity and heritage. My Greek community were my relatives, the many, many, many relatives that we all have. And so, yes, there was this organization, and we've interacted with them at various times in our personal and professional lives. But for me, the Greek community were my cousins, uncles, aunts, kubari. Oh boy, I shouldn't have said that. How do you define kubari?
godparents.
Godparents.
Yes, godparents and maids of honors and whatnot. And I think in terms of the reasons to go to school, you've heard a couple of examples where the family members were themselves either educated and intended to continue that here. I come from the other background where education was stopped for my parents. My dad, stopped at grade 3 because of the war happening in Greece, and his long dream for his children were for them to go on to university. And so for me, it wasn't dad's done this or mom's done this, and therefore I have to follow. It was they haven't had that opportunity. Here's your chance to do it. And when I was thinking back to why I had decided law, it was really because they were, as many Greeks were back in that instance, in the 80s and 70s, they were small business owners. And in the midst of a litigation matter, when they needed somebody to help them out, we knew of 1 or 2 Greek lawyers, and I got frustrated when, they felt frustrated not being able to express themselves as easily or as readily and maneuver the legal system. And so I thought, that doesn't seem right, and led me down that path and to where we are. And it just seems it's come full circle. I'm working with internationally trained lawyers, because I think that Greekness that I felt and that need to connect with the community, my small C community, is so strong still. So again, the community, the focus on a large C community or small C, I think is one that each person has a different approach to.
That's really interesting, but it sounds like the focus on education then is consistent right
Absolutely.
across. I noticed does anybody else want to talk about that before?
I just want to focus on the great divide that Mahi brought up and defined basically the 2 type of Greeks, the ones that belong to organizations. Me, all my life, I can only think of the Greek community in terms of organizations, from the umbrella right down to the village association. And there is probably the majority of Greeks who are like Mahi and Ria, who have nothing to do with organizations. You probably couldn't even mention or name most of them.
Well, I'm afraid I have to jump in, Jim, because you don't know.
I know your father.
Not only my father, one playground was the McGill campus, the other playground was the Montreal community,
Fair
Greek
enough.
Montreal community, and I am very much involved in our Annunciation of the Virgin Mary Church in Parkdale in Spades. So let's be careful when we generalize. The divides are much more blurred.
I'm not generalizing about you, and I'm just saying Mahi brought up what I see as the great divide between the 2 types of Greeks, the ones that belong to the organizations, the associations, and the others that feel very much Greek but are not involved with the organized Greek community. I wasn't casting any aspersions. And in terms of the profession, that has followed as well. Initially, you were a Greek lawyer, and you were very busy, and you specialized in Greeks. And I've heard stories about people lining up around Dundas Square waiting to see Freddie Flores.
This is the 60s?
And he was I think it was called in the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
when they were arriving and buying houses and buying businesses. So initially it said we specialized in Greeks, and now the recent calls, if you look at the members of the HCLA, many of them speak very little Greek, and in fact they've gone to functions where it was all lawyers of Greek descent, to give us a proper description, and I did not hear a word of Greek spoken, whereas in Greek community affairs, most of the time you will never hear an English word spoken except when it's Gringlish.
So who does speak Greek here?
Are you differentiating about the quality?
Yeah, let's talk quality.
I leave it to you.
I'm fluent in kitchen Greek. I speak Greek.
I get
I
by the
do.
kitchen Greek.
Yeah.
I do.
You do
I think
too?
we all do.
Mine is pretty minimal.
Buddy?
I mean, mine's better when if I go there and I'm forced to. But we never spoke. My mother spoke Greek to her sister, but my parents spoke English. We grew up in English, and in terms of the community, I think that there's that cultural sense versus the linguistic sense of your community.
Right.
For me, it's cultural, not linguistic, and that has an impact on the extent to which I've been involved in Greek things because I didn't speak Greek. And church was a perfect example. We went to church every Sunday when I was a kid. I didn't understand a blind word of it.
Nobody does.
Not
And
a
you
word.
think those people who spoke
Nobody does, don't worry about
Well,
it.
that's right.
No.
But now when I go to the church on Sororan, because I used to live on Galley, when I go to that church at Easter, they do everything in both languages.
Yeah.
Because there's so much intermarriage now, that's the only way to keep the community and,
Keep
so.
the membership.
Well, in
coming
fact,
back.
when my son was being baptized, because my husband's not Greek, then my mother told the priest the father's not Greek, and he said, "I don't care, I'm getting the child." So, it was like- and they do it all in English. So that I think there's that divide too, the linguistic versus
Yes.
the cultural.
But you know, I mean, both of my children are in law now, and neither of them speak Greek. They have some understanding, but neither of them speak Greek, and yet they're very proud of their Greek
Yeah, yeah.
heritage.
My wife considers that she's not married to me because the ceremony was all in Greek and she didn't understand a single word. So I said, well, that's very comforting. I didn't understand a single word either. But my Greek is very, very fluent. The only thing I can't do is spell. But the story I tell is that I relearned my Greek through Greek community affairs and through my clients. And I made some effort to learn how to say directors, corporation, and shareholders in Greek. So I was explaining to someone what was happening, that he was a director, a shareholder, and he had a corporation, etc. And he looked blankly at me and said, "What are you talking about?" I said, you got shares. "Oh, why'd you say so?" He understood shares and director. He couldn't understand the Greek words for it.
For heaven's sake. Well, so that's the difference between the organized community, some of it, and the small c community, which might be either cultural or linguistic. What about the actual pioneers that we have listed somewhere here on a piece of paper? I wonder about the personal relationships you have with some of the older members. Have you, for instance, heard of, what is your own awareness of your history? And Jim can't speak to this. Well, you can, but I know that you have an exceptional understanding. For instance, did you know that the first Greek lawyer, a female Greek lawyer, was Stella Panarites in 1953? I'm just curious. Now you did, Ernie.
Yeah, I knew her personally.
What was
yeah.
she like?
She was very fine. She had a few health problems, and she was from Cobalt, and she tried to practice up there, but it was a very poor community then. And she was in Timmins, and then she came to North Bay, worked with the Wallace firm, and she was a fine lady, but she had some health problems, and she's just a very bright girl. She got through Osgood in the very difficult years, the early 50s. It was tough to get through. And I think she passed away about 10, 15 years ago,
I
I think,
think
didn't
80, in the mid-80s.
she? Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
She was a good friend of my mother. She used to come over and get some Greek lessons from my mother on the side. Yeah,
Interesting. She must have had a tough
yeah.
road
She
to
had,
hoe,
she had a
eh?
tough road to hoe. Yeah, she had a tough road to hoe.
What about you, Gina? Did you know about Stella Panarides, or I'm also...
I knew about her through, I think primarily through the HCLA and through my involvement with Greek lawyers when I joined the profession. I did not know her personally. One of the benefits of joining the HCLA was, of course, to be able to network and get to know lawyers who had come before me, and I think that's one of the key benefits of the HCLA.
That's interesting. What about, when I was reading through some of the biographies too, the mother is very important. Of course, every
Yes,
group,
yeah.
Scottish people's mothers are
Mhm.
important too, but the mothers are often very well educated. We talked about that, but so are there a lot of teachers in your generation's families too?
No.
Because, no?
Not for me. I don't. Can I, on the point of sort of influencers and
Yes.
and Allison, I don't know if it was you or Constance, and I'm sorry, who mentioned, you used a phrase, and I noted it down, overrepresented in legal education, and I noted it down only because after many, many years in admissions at Osgoode and now being at U of T, so at least 2 of the 6 Ontario law schools, my one big personal heartbreak sometimes was that there weren't as many applicants of Greek heritage as I would have liked to have seen. And for sometimes when there were applicants, they may not have been as prepared as other applicants. And so, you know, I'm not sure where the thought there is an overrepresentation and what's that relative to in the legal profession of Greeks, because frankly, I would not necessarily have made that comment in terms of what my experience has been, and the more education of what's needed earlier on of young people who are thinking about going into legal education, I think is something that we've always been working on and trying to get into people's minds earlier on.
Well, staying with that, why do you think that is? Basically an underrepresentation then.
Sorry, I don't know if anybody, I'll just start the conversation. I can remember clearly we had done a session through the HCLA community service session where we had discussed how to get into law school, and a couple of young women at that time, and this was about 10 or 12 years ago, so things have changed to some degree, but a couple of young women came in and said, oh gosh, you know, this is something that I want to do. My dad, or one was saying my dad, the other was saying my parents, and it left an impression on me, would never allow me to go on, you know, 3 years of law school after 4 years. In some families, the sense was it's too much, there's other commitments for some of the young women in the community to proceed, and this is at least for the women in the community. And that may account for part of it. I'm not suggesting that it's there are not a lot of students who are applying, but not an overrepresentation, I wouldn't say. I don't think. I'd like to hear others' feedback on that, though.
Sure.
I would agree with that. I think we're severely underrepresented. I think we have a long way to go. And being an active member and board member of the HCLA, and as president, one of my personal objectives was to get out and encourage students from Greek descent, even at the high school level, encouraging them to reaching out to them that, hey, consider law as a career for these very reasons. And I agree with Gina. Gina and I speak from time to time. The applicants are just not there, and the ones that are there are, frankly, a little weak. And we got to do more, I think, as a community to encourage this. I'll turn it over to others.
I have to say I didn't have that impression that we were underrepresented, and I certainly haven't seen any, I don't know if there is any data that would be able to settle the issue, but I would defer to Gina on the issue of
How many Greek
admissions.
lawyers are there in Toronto?
Well, in Ontario, there's just over 30,000, more or less.
How many?
The number of lawyers total in Ontario?
In Ontario?
It's about 40 now, 42.
40?
42,000.
So, I mean, I'll tell you, our database, which includes all Greeks across the country, there's no more than 700. Now, granted, maybe in the last year to 2 years, there's maybe been a few additions, but I'm quite certain there's probably less than 10 Greek law students in Ontario right now. And Gina, I mean, there's probably 3 or 4 in Osgoode, maybe 1 or 2 which includes
2 in Toronto.
2 in Toronto, which So the numbers are there. I mean, you do the percentages. It's not as strong as we would like.
It's interesting, it would be interesting to see what the percentage is that go to post-secondary, because that's probably higher, but does it stop at post-secondary and there's less of a shift? Because my sense is that the numbers going to post-secondary is pretty good compared to
pretty
some
good.
other ethnic groups, but that maybe it's stopping as it goes to the
Well,
next
then you
level.
have to consider, I think, also the dropout rates over a 3-4 year period. Those numbers are quite high. And then you look at the cultural diversity as well, and the numbers get thinner and thinner. And then you look at the applicants, the number of applications that are being submitted. And Gina, I'm sure it's like 10, 15 to 1. What's the ratio right now of students being admitted? So when you look at those numbers, and I don't have those numbers in front of me, I'm quite certain it's not as high as we would like it to be. And I think it is. I think it's cost, perhaps. I think it's culturally. I think that's changing. I think, in my case, personally speaking, I was always encouraged to go to school, get an education, marry a good Greek girl, which I did. But it was always kind of the male-dominant kind of perspective in my household, and I'm certainly not embarrassed of it, but that's just the mentality my parents had when they came over in the 60s. They didn't know any better, and I'm thankful that I did, because obviously our eyes are opened, and we see the world in a different light today. I think things are changing. Certainly in my generation and my children's generation coming up, the viewpoint has changed, and I would think in the next generation those numbers will start to change. But I really think it starts in the household. I mean, you can.
I just want to come at this slightly differently. I'm not sure it's all cultural. And I want to fast forward. Gina and I were at Osgood together, graduated, and at the 10-year reunion for Osgood, I had to go through my class list to find everybody and invite them to the reunion. And I was astounded to see that between 50 and 60% of the graduates of Osgood had dropped out of the law practice. And so I wonder, is it because it's prohibitive to go to law school or culturally discouraged? Or are there some bright people who are saying, I don't know about these law careers, let's try other career paths? And I'd throw that out as a broader question that has, I think it's more nuanced than just culture.
I'm sure. Gina, I know you have to leave shortly. Do you have anything else that you would like to add at this point?
No, I'll just listen on for about 5 more minutes, and if I need to hang up at that point, I'm really sorry. This is an enjoyable conversation so far.
That's great. I would like to, does anybody else want to speak to that at the moment?
I would just like to comment about Gabe Sampieros,
Yes.
who recently died, who left law to go into business and ran Cara Foods. And we know him because he was a graduate of the University of Ottawa, where I teach, and where my partner is the dean. And Gabe was I would say probably our most generous alumni, who gave more money than anyone else back to the law school, and he did so to benefit students. His goal was to create spaces in the building that would nurture student community, and we realized that by going into business, he was more successful than he would have been staying in law. He took his legal expertise, but he put it into the service of entrepreneurialism. And it may be that it's not a question so much of finding law inhospitable, but seeing greener pastures elsewhere.
I think
And
you're
he's
right,
a
yes.
wonderful example of that.
That's true, and that may be particularly true in recent generations. I'd like to go back to the earlier time. I was speaking with Bill Vorvis. I don't know how many of you know
I know
him.
Bill.
Do you?
Yeah.
So he's a Guelph lawyer,
Well, right.
and he was called in 1951. And I will be speaking with him personally later. But he described how, as a young lawyer, just after his call, he could not get a job anywhere because of discrimination, until the treasurer of the day helped him get a position. So perhaps some people decided that it was going to be difficult between subtle and hard barriers to get into a profession, but I wonder, have you experienced discrimination in your careers, or is that something of the olden days?
None at all. None at all. I don't doubt way back in the 30s and 40s that there may have been, but I never experienced it.
I must
Certainly
say,
in a small community anyway, I came from.
I must say I didn't feel that I was discriminated against because of my Greek heritage. People did have trouble with my name. I got tired of having to spell it in court every day. People no longer have trouble with my name. But I have to say, if I felt that there was any discrimination, and I was called an 82, it was more because against women.
Yeah.
Yes.
Rather than because of Greek heritage. And I articled
And
in
that's
the
changed
criminal
now,
law
too.
field, and I was the very first woman articling student that my principal had, and that's because he just never gotten around to having one and wasn't sure he'd feel comfortable given the facts that sometimes arise in criminal cases. And I was the first of about 5 in a row. But it was, I only got that job because he called one of the professors at Osgood, and I hadn't started to look yet. There was a last minute, his articling student had dropped off at the last minute. And so I got that opportunity. So I felt it, particularly in the criminal field, there was more discrimination against women. I didn't feel it because of my Greek background.
Okay.
I think that's quite a bit different in the earlier days.
Yes.
Before I go, I would like to say, I mean, I think, I know I personally, and I've said this to her, and I'll say it in public, owe Maki a big thanks, because she has been a mentor to many Greek women in the profession. When I was deciding between articling positions, and I'd gone through the matching process and had to make some decisions, and I had interviewed a number of different firms, and there were a number of different opportunities, a big firm, large firm, and one firm that, to me at that point, and given the rationale that I said before as to why I joined the profession, the one firm that to me felt quote-unquote right was a firm composed primarily of Greek lawyers that served primarily, not only, but primarily Greek clients, because it felt like it solidified the reason why I had joined the profession, to be able to then join another group of lawyers that were doing the same thing.
So that was Sotis Carvanis Karakatsanis.
It is.
Gina worked there.
Thank you.
On
And
that
so
note,
did
I'm going to
Rhea.
have to leave with regret.
good,
Thank you,
really.
everybody.
Bye, Gina.
Bye-bye now.
Hi, thank you.
So did
I'd echo what
interesting.
Andromache said, just in terms of my own experience. I never felt that there were any issues for me because of my Greekness. If there were issues, it was being a woman, more than anything else. And again, because, I mean, I'm second generation too, so my parents were born in Canada, so it was an even further tangential connection back to feeling that sort of, if there was discrimination, it never came up in my context that I was aware of, although the name thing used to drive me crazy, because it was almost like, people don't do that as much anymore. We're much more used to hearing, but I'm sure some of the communities that are newer in Canada feel it too, that sense of panic. They hear a name and they panic because it doesn't sound like something that they're used to, and they're not really listening. So that was the only time I used to get irritated on that issue, but otherwise it was more women than cultural.
Same experience as Mahi, only it seems I caved in. My name had as many syllables as hers. And when I was articling, I did a lot of motion work, and I would appear before Judge Henry, who had great difficulty reading. He's very bad eyesight. And you'd get up in motions court. Good morning, Your Honor. My name's Karamatanis, initial J. Just a minute. Just. And you'd start spelling, and of course, the room is full of lawyers and students. Oh, get it over with. How dare you? So then you'd finish spelling and then say, I'm with Hughes Amos. Oh, Hughes Amos, my alma mater. Then you were somebody.
So you changed your name.
By February, I'd had enough of it, and I went from Karamatanis to Karas.
I must say I had a stubborn streak. I thought, they're going to learn to say it.
The last names was not uncommon.
No.
Even
Yes.
today,
Nick
And
Paul.
it's not just that's right. It's not just the last name. We kind of got used to that. You're Dimitrios in Greece. I get off the boat, literally, and they say you're Jim.
Yeah.
Whatever you say. And there's some really, really weird names and changes. And even Ria went from Eleftheria to Ria. And I must say, I did the same thing with my daughter. She went from Eleftheria to Ellie. So,
To my daughter, who's Eleftheria, who's now El.
It says, why did you do that to me, Dad?
Now, Eleftheria means freedom, for those who don't speak
Yeah.
Greek.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful name.
We'll tell you just a little note. My mother was born in 1949 after the war, the Civil War in Greece, which was freedom and liberty,
Oh, I
and
see.
hence the name of it. And it's cultural again, where you're naming your children, parents, and my son, for example, is named after my father, and my daughter is named after my mother, and my second daughter is named after my father-in-law.
So these names are important.
Yes, very.
I'll just tell you a little story. My brother practiced a little bit of criminal law, and apparently there was a drunk that came into the police station, was picked up, I guess, for drunk driving, and said, "You want me to call a lawyer?" And he said, "Yeah." And who do you want to call? "Well, I call that Irish lawyer." And the guy said, "Donnelly?" "No, Luco Dallas."
Now, Spiro is very good. What's Ernest? That's not a Greek name.
No, it's Anastasios.
Anastasios.
Anastasios, Anasti, Ernest. As a matter of fact, they registered me as Tom.
That's right.
Tom, and I changed it when I came to university.
Yeah.
I went on my birth certificate.
Yeah.
No sense to it.
But they called me Ernest. So.
Athanasios.
My
my-
husband's Tom, and he's Athanasios.
My father was Athanasios, and he was dean.
And so that's okay? I mean, that's interesting. I'm surprised.
Oh, it's not okay. That's why I'm still on trauma care.
That's right. Very good. Absolutely. And one thing that it's not okay from my tiny perspective is it makes it hard to find some of the pioneers. We did find that the second Greek lawyer was called George Campbell. That's what he practiced as, but he was George Carambellis.
Oh, is that? I never heard of
Do
him.
No, I'm probably, he practiced in London.
London,
And there may be other people like that. Do you know of any that are not on our list?
There's somebody in Belleville that practiced with Ben Hurley.
And Hurley.
Well, Philip Mitches,
Yes.
Mitches.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Allen,
Yes.
Alayanis.
Oh, what was his?
Alayanis.
L.
Crown attorney.
Yes. And
Yes.
he's the only one that I made great attempts to talk to, and he refused to talk to me.
Yes.
away.
He passed away last
He
year,
did,
I think.
yes.
Oh,
this
did
year.
Steve Allen
His-
pass away last year?
Yes.
I was at university with him a year.
Really?
He was a crown in a number of my
Yeah.
cases when I was
Was he?
defense counsel.
Really?
His sister came and saw me. She gave me pictures. She gave me all kinds of information. He wouldn't come. He wouldn't even give me his birthday because he was still looking for a young wife.
Some people are missing from our list because if they are living and they don't answer our letter, we can't put them on our list. So it's some awkward misses. Now, what else? Well, let's see. What will we talk about? What would you like to talk about now?
Well, Jim earlier mentioned the fact that there were a lot of sole practitioners. So I think the profile of lawyers in the Greek Canadian
Yes.
community has changed over time as well, starting with a lot of sole practitioners, then some firms that, Gina referred to the firm that I had joined when after I was called to the bar. And it was probably one of the larger firms for the Greek community at the time. And by that I mean we may have gone up to 10 lawyers at that time. But when I started, it was with my husband, Tom Carvanis, John Sotos, who was a partner, and then another partner joined us, Lou Alexopoulos. That was 4 of us. And over time it was up to 10, I think. And Gina was there. Did it go up to 12? Well, Ria was one of them. Gina was another. And but it was, I think, one of the that started to practice kind of together. Up until that time, there had been
Only one.
a lot of sole practitioners.
The closest.
And I'm sorry, just to finish that thought, I was going to say, and now you see the next generation, a lot of them are going for the big law firms
Yes.
and for the more mainstream, if I can call it that, kinds of jobs. So it's an interesting profile over a couple of generations.
Absolutely.
There's almost no one now that goes into private practice. The only ones left are the dinosaurs from the 60s and 70s. Emergis and Emergis came closest to a firm, and they had one or two juniors now and then, or associates.
Nick Paul had a few juniors, maybe
James
three.
Pardon?
Nick Paul had a few juniors,
Nick
maybe
Paul,
three.
the odd junior, and nobody stayed with them. And he wasn't really partners with Bill Andrews. They were just sharing office space, but they put both names on the letterhead, so it looked like a firm, but it really wasn't. And Nick Paul would have, said, juniors that went through and left because he really wasn't interested in having a partner, but he would keep juniors. Jim Kokonis is the exception. He became the patent and trademark expert,
Yes.
and he's with an Ottawa firm whose name is Martin Bigelow, one of the biggies. But as for the rest, as far as I could tell, they're all sole practitioners, and even Basil Sullivan, I beg your pardon, the original Basil had Basil Sullivan, a mid-sized firm. Bill Basil, I think he shared office space with Nick Paul, and I think he and his sister eventually made Basil and Basil. And I think that's about it as far as partnerships are concerned. But Sotos Carvanis were the first significant partnership, aside from Basil Sullivan, that in fact lasted. And
You know, it's
still
an interesting question, isn't it, in terms of if the community starts out by creating firms of its own kind, but as they become more mainstream, they disappear into the diaspora of larger firms and non-Greek firms, then in terms of the issue of more Greeks going to law school, whatever, there aren't examples in front of them that they can say, look at all those Greek firms, I could do that, I could maybe article for one of them, etc., because they've disappeared into the mainstream. And so it becomes this kind of, it's a sign of we've made it to get into the big firms and to get away from that, but on the other hand, you lose the sense of the community because you don't have any visible presence. That is what happens when your firm stood out. So people, young Greek lawyers could say, there's an example of where I could go that I will feel comfortable or whatever. So I wonder about that, if that's part of the issue too.
I'd like to pick up on that because I think there's a natural evolution in the various groups again. And, the question that follows on your comment is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I tend to think I'm not necessarily fussed that we don't have the Greek flagship firms from the point of view that I'm delighted when I see colleagues of Greek descent all over the landscape, and it can be in government, it can be in the courts, it can be in large firms, medium firms. And then that comes back to, what is it that makes us different? What is it that helps us contribute to Canadian society? It's our Greek identity, our values that make up who we are.
I think also those Greek firms, I think, served a purpose, and maybe you can speak on this, perhaps in the late 70s, early 80s, when they were required. For example, my father, mostly Greek-speaking, or Greek-speaking at home, required the services of a Greek-speaking lawyer. Whereas now, again, our generation, I really don't care, frankly, that whether you can speak Greek or not, because my first language is English, and I'm just looking for a very competent lawyer who's reasonable in their fees and can handle the work. But I think it's evolution. At the time, they served a purpose where you had families and the immigrant experience who required those services, where now I think we're past that, which, again, I think is not a bad thing.
It's interesting because a lot of the young people are interested in the Hellenic Lawyers Association. Nonetheless, even though they're going off into the bigger firms and they don't need it quite in the same way as a previous generation did for the support and the mentoring and the networking and the referrals. And I think in part that comes back to the question that you were implicitly asking, Sophia, which is, as a community matures, how do you and do you need to hold on to a Greek identity or a Greek Canadian identity? And I think that you do. I think it just takes different forms. And I'm really pleased to see that the young people who don't speak Greek are coming out to the association events and are enjoying the camaraderie. And I think in part that's because our profession is so large, the legal profession is so large, and people look for communities, smaller communities to belong to, and to feel a part of, and that more intimate feeling of and building relationships in that kind of a context is so much easier than the profession as a whole it's just too large.
Well, the biggest need the Greek community has now is more homes for the aged than nursing homes. That's the big change. Whereas in the 70s, it's true. No. I'm on the board of directors for the Hellenic Home for the Aged in Mahi. Next week are the elections. Please vote for me. But seriously, that is the greatest need. And as Jim said, the clients that came to me, they didn't care. They didn't judge my competence. They had no idea. They came there because I spoke Greek. And that holds true only for the generation that's passing now. The immigrants of the 50s are now in their 70s and 80s, and that group is, for better or for worse, disappearing.
But is there any loyalty in the sense of the generation following the Greek-speaking generation? Do they stick with the lawyers that their parents had?
Not very much, no. And I mean, if they, some of them have kept the wills, they will go there for the will. They may go for their purchase of their house, but for anything more complicated, as Jim said, they look for the specialist, for the one who is known to be competent in that field, rather than the generalist who still exists but is fast disappearing, so having a hard time surviving. And now we're entering or hoping to go into a different generation from the current disintegration of the Greeks who came, who disappeared from the Greek community through death or other reasons, and their children who are no longer terribly involved. We're hoping to see them coming back following the American model, where the Greek community is much older, and you will find churches, for example, where the service is all in Greek, and you will find lawyers who will go back and serve on Greek community organizations, whereas the current generation is involved very little. I am I'm just about the only lawyer of Greek descent that's involved in Greek community organizations. Almost. I shouldn't. There's a couple more.
But there are reasons for that, Jim. And I say that with the greatest respect. And just to put things in perspective here, again, by way of clarification, there's well over 100,000 Greeks living in the Toronto GT area. I certainly can't speak about North Bay or Sudbury outside Toronto, yet there's probably less than 3,000 paid-up members in this, quote, Greek community established. That's well under 3%. And so the vast majority of Greeks out there are Greek in their own identity and their cultural, and they're proud to be Greeks in their own way. But there's a long history there why the majority of Greeks stay away from the greater Greek community and being involved. So, but I think that's for another discussion.
Probably true with all communities, though.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's the ethnic and cultural and historical communities, and then there are the organizations.
There are.
I would think that it's always a small percentage of the community that gets involved in the organizations. I don't think we're different from the Ukrainian communities, the Polish communities, and the Jewish communities. I think.
And probably it's
In a
Toronto
significant way.
versus other parts of the province is
And
a
you should
difference
also
too.
remember, Mahi may not be a member of any of those communities, and most people are not members. That doesn't mean that they don't use them. They baptize, they marry, they bury, they go to church there. That is the community. You can do everything without being a member. Some of them, if you want to get married, you give them $50, you become a member, you never renew. So it doesn't mean because they're not formally members, they don't belong to that community or to that organization. To some extent, all use the organization. They will go to the parades. You know, tens of thousands show up to those parades, and you can bet that most of them don't belong to any organization at all.
How many lawyers, how many lawyers in Toronto of Greek descent?
I'd say roughly between 2 and 250 presently.
Huh, 250 for 100,000, that's pretty, not a bad
That's
ratio.
No.
It is interesting that once the emigration from Greece stopped, which is basically 1980, that's when the Hellenic Canadian Lawyers Association started.
True, and maybe I'll turn that over to I guess some of the founding members in the room.
Yes.
Why that was the case.
I know I was involved at that time. I'm not sure, Jim, if you were involved in '82, and but that's when a number of us thought it would be good to get together, and initially probably thought of it more as a way of just meeting the other lawyers out there, having some networking opportunities, some mentoring, really just to see who was out there and get to know them. And so we started to do that. It was more informal. We did drop, I think we drew up a charter or something like that. And we met, and at the time, I think we had started the scholarships at the time. That's another very important, I
Yes.
think, role that the association plays. But it was really a way of just, I think I alluded to it earlier, it was really a way of forming a community within a much larger community and meeting people who may have had similar experiences and so on. I know for myself, I had clerked for the Court of Appeal, and I had had some interest from larger firms, and I just thought it would be nice to work for myself with a small group of people, and it was more that entrepreneurial, which I think is part of the Greek heritage,
Think
part of the Greek roots, and so that's probably what guided me towards going into private practice. And I think once you do that, you're looking around for like-minded people,
Yes.
and that was, I think, the genesis of it. And over time, it lapsed. There was a period of time when it lapsed, and I can't remember now when it was.
1990?
1990 maybe. It then became much more formalized, and it's actually going quite strong since then.
Yeah.
And I think it's great. I go to as many events as I can, and
Got
I
a
think
big one
it's
coming
I
up
like the mentoring.
in
I've got a
October,
mentee.
so, agreed. Certainly, we have a large social component where we get together and each of us knows one another. But having said that, we serve, I think, a legitimate purpose. We encourage students from a very young age. The scholarship program is alive and well.
Very
We award
important.
2 scholarships every year.
How does it
A
work?
mentoring
How
program.
does the scholarship program work? What do you
There's a formal application process that we send out to all law schools across the country, and there's a deadline. As a matter of fact, I think the deadline is, the one right now is, could be today, September 30th, or next week, I'm not sure. I'm just not on the board, so I'm not exactly up to date. There's also the mentorship program where we match students, first, second year students with also first year, second year calls with more senior members of the bar. And in addition to the ongoing, events we have in conferences and speakers, and we always have a guest speaker who attends our president's dinner, and it's all good stuff. I mean, it's a small core. We don't get to 200 or 300 Greek lawyers from Toronto and surrounding areas, but the group that does exist, I think, are very loyal, and
It's a
we
great
support.
organization.
Yeah, I think we
Absolutely.
support
Yeah.
one another, and it's good in many respects. And frankly, it's it's really brought us together today, and I'm
that's
and I'm
exactly
proud of
right.
that, because I met Jim and I met the other fine people at this table many years ago, and you know, personally, Jim inspired me, and we worked on this project together, and as a result, here we are. So all this valuable information as a result of the Hellenic Canadian Lawyers Association, something that was very deep and passionate to both of us. And again, Alison, I want to thank you personally for your efforts and contacting myself and getting together in the ongoing discussions, because this is valuable information that will be permanently in the archives and the records for many generations to come. So thank you for that.
I just want to add to that because, and again, not being originally from Toronto, many of these names I don't know. But one thing that the Hellenic Lawyers Association has offered to us is the next generation of trailblazers, whether it's Andromache, John Soto's, the number of board members. And I think one dimension of the success of the association is our younger members can talk to these trailblazers and connect immediately and learn from them, and figure out how to navigate the obstacles. Because as much as we are very much part of the Canadian fabric, as Canadians, and we have been accepted in the mainstream, figuring out how to play the game of becoming a lawyer, getting through law school, getting through bar ads, finding an articling job, and then mapping out our career and figuring out the choices is not an easy task.
You mentioned receiving help from Andromache on that. Is there other people that you would like to credit with helping you get through the system and figure out what you want to do?
It's the immediate camaraderie. I mean, my principal was Tom Carvanis at Sotos Carvanis, and we had many discussions about thinking through career options. I credit him. I remember going to him and saying, "There's this Harvard," and I was a restless type. I was in private practice and had an exceptional experience for the 6 years I was there. But I had done, in the summer of the Oka crisis, my first law summer job was in Montreal with the Mohawks of Ganawage, and was thrown into that quite by accident, and was always trying to find a way to get back to that subject area. But in being restless in about my third year, I went to Tom and I said, "There's this Harvard ADR program, and there's this Osgood LLM program. One's a 2.5-year commitment, one's 6 weeks." And Tom was very candid and said, "Well, okay, so you get the Harvard label, but it's big deal, 6 weeks. If you're up to it, go with the LLM." And I value that.
I hadn't heard that story. Tom's my husband.
Yes.
And so again, here was somebody who was a few years ahead of me in the experience process, but was somebody who I could have a candid conversation, on all dimensions of that issue. So that's one example.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, you don't know people, but because they have a cultural connection to you, there's a kind of an implicit shorthand that lives in those conversations, and it's not even something you have to. It's like I feel a camaraderie with people from Montreal just because I know that they have there's something about that's intangible, but it's there, isn't it? You say, "Oh, you're Greek," so there's something that connects you, even though you may have absolutely nothing in common. And it may not last beyond that first couple of conversations. You might then decide you can't stand each other, but there's something there that brings you together. And I'm sure that's something that's why it's so valuable to have examples of that, because at least it brings you in a door that you all share,
Ernie?
I think you're right on. I agree with it.
Were you close to the other Greek lawyers in the community and in the north? Because I'm sure there was a couple in
There was
Sudbury.
there's my brother in North Bay, and then Charlie Ferezis he was raised in Sturgeon Falls, which is part of the North Bay community.
Yes.
There's practice in Sudbury.
And
And
that
then,
was-
of course, Stella. And that's...
That was it. You were
that
pretty
was it.
close then.
That
Mhm.
was it.
Some
But all our
trailblazers you
parents
were.
encouraged us to go on to school, whether, not necessarily law, but,
Mhm.
go on to school. You don't want
Yes.
to work in the restaurant for 7 days a week, do you?
George Spiel used to talk about that because
Yeah.
his father had a restaurant in Kingston.
That's right.
My
Yeah.
father had a restaurant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so George Spiel used to talk about that.
George Spiel's father had a restaurant in Toronto, and it was burned during the Greek riots of 1917.
I didn't know
And
that.
I told him, I said, what? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I said, haven't you read? Didn't you ever ask about it? No, because they started here in the early 20th century, and that was one of the restaurants that was destroyed during the riots.
Yeah.
Wow.
No.
Well, George Spiel is a good example of, he did a memoir, and he put it together when we had an earlier project, which was of sort of trying to get soul and small practitioners to come and talk with us and whatever, and we wanted to encourage them to do their memoirs. He did one, and he put it all together, and primarily for his kids, but he left it for us, and in about 2 or 3 years after he finished it, he died.
Yes.
So there's this wonderful piece in our archives with his whole story.
Is
all
it
the way back.
available?
Yeah, it's,
You
we
say
have
you
it
did-
all right.
Did you, George die?
George died, yes.
When?
About a
Is it
year ago?
a year and a half, something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
He was a year ahead of me.
And I know who got his personal papers.
Who did?
Mike Muratidis.
Which is he? Where is he? Is he here in Toronto?
Interesting. Would anyone like to have a break for coffee or tea or a little snack?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because with the Greekness and the color, you and I both went in. I'm thinking about it.